When my brother got into debt, my parents cashed out their savings to bail him out. When I needed help covering surgery, my mom said, "He has a future. You're just a burden." My dad added, "We can't save you both." I just nodded and proclaimed, "Thanks for the clarity." 4 months later, I made a move none of them saw coming. Now they're blowing up my phone. Please, just call. I, 32M, always knew my place in the family hierarchy. Second born, second choice, second thought. But I never imagined it would be spelled out so clearly until that cold February morning when I sat across from my parents at their kitchen table. My medical bills spread between us like evidence of my inadequacy. The surgery wasn't optional. The tumor pressing against my spine had already started affecting my mobility, and my insurance covered barely 60%. $28,000. That's what I needed to avoid spending the rest of my life in a wheelchair or worse. My mother stared at the papers without touching them, her coffee growing cold in her hands. My father rubbed his temples in that familiar way that meant I was causing him a headache again. The silence stretched until I couldn't bear it anymore and asked if they could help, even partially. That's when she said it. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. My brother had a future ahead of him, she explained. Medical school, a promising career, a life worth investing in. I was just a burden they couldn't afford to carry anymore. My father nodded along, adding that they simply couldn't save us both, and they'd already made their choice. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. 28 years of being the backup son crystallized into perfect clarity. I thanked them for their honesty, gathered my papers, and walked out. My brother had racked up $43,000 in gambling debts 6 months earlier. High-stakes poker games and sports betting that spiraled out of control during his second year of med school. Our parents didn't hesitate. They liquidated their retirement savings, cashed out bonds, even took a second mortgage on the house, all to keep their golden boy's future intact. But $28,000 for their other son's spine? That was where they drew the line. I drove straight to the bank and applied for a medical loan at 18% interest. The monthly payments would cripple me financially for years, but what choice did I have? The surgery was scheduled for the following week. Recovery took 2 months. 2 months of lying in a hospital bed and then my apartment, staring at the ceiling and thinking. My phone rang exactly twice during that time. Once was a wrong number. The other was my mother asking if I could cover my brother's car insurance payment because they were a little tight that month. I told her I'd get right on it and hung up without another word. That's when the plan began forming. It wasn't elaborate or particularly clever. It was just inevitable. My brother had always been careless with personal information. Passwords written on sticky notes, important documents left lying around, financial details shared freely because he'd never had to worry about consequences. During family dinners before everything fell apart, he'd casually mention his new apartment, his expensive tastes, his complete lack of financial awareness. Our parents had always cleaned up his messes. It started with small things. I knew his social security number by heart. We'd shared a room growing up, and he'd never been discreet about anything. His mother's maiden name, first pet, elementary school, all family knowledge. His password patterns were embarrassingly predictable, usually some variation of his birthday or our childhood address. The identity theft wasn't dramatic. No grand heists or elaborate schemes. Just methodical, careful work spread across several weeks. A credit card application here, a small loan there. Nothing massive enough to trigger immediate red flags, but steady enough to build momentum. I opened accounts in his name, made purchases I could easily return later, established a pattern of financial activity that looked legitimate on the surface. The key was patience. Each step had to look organic, like natural progression of someone young and financially reckless. Meanwhile, I started documenting everything. Screenshots, photos, detailed records of every transaction and application. I kept meticulous notes, building a comprehensive file that would make it easy to trace everything back when the time came. The beauty was in the subtlety. Small charges that could easily be missed, accounts that wouldn't send statements to his current address, purchases that aligned with his lifestyle. I knew him well enough to make it all look authentic. 3 weeks in, I started phase 2. Larger purchases, bigger loans, more significant financial commitments. Nothing too obvious. I wasn't trying to destroy his credit immediately. I was building toward something bigger. The breakthrough came when I realized I could access his student loan information. He'd been cavalier about his financial aid documents, leaving them scattered around during one of his visits home. With that information, I could modify his enrollment status, adjust his loan disbursements, even redirect certain payments. Medical school is expensive, and financial aid is complicated. A few small changes here and there could easily be attributed to administrative errors or processing delays. But the cumulative effect would be devastating. I spent hours on the phone with various financial institutions, always careful to call during busy periods when representatives were more likely to rush through verification processes. I had all the right answers to their security questions, all the correct personal details. Why wouldn't I? I was his brother. By month 3, the foundation was solid. Multiple accounts, various financial obligations, a complex web of debt and responsibility that all traced back to him. But I wasn't done. The real brilliance was in the timing. I knew our parents' financial situation better than they thought. The second mortgage payment was due every 15th. Their property taxes were coming up in April. My father's small business always struggled during the slow season. They were already stretched thin from bailing out my brother the first time. So I waited until they'd be most vulnerable, most likely to panic and make emotional decisions rather than logical ones. The anonymous tip to the financial aid office came first. Just a concerned citizen reporting suspicious activity on student loan accounts. Nothing specific, just enough to trigger an investigation. I included copies of certain documents that raised questions about enrollment verification and loan disbursement accuracy. Then I contacted the credit monitoring services. Multiple accounts opened in rapid succession, unusual spending patterns, potential identity theft concerns. I provided detailed evidence and requested immediate investigation. The third call went to the state medical board. Questions about a student's financial stability and potential ethical violations related to fraud and misrepresentation. I was careful to present it as a concern rather than an accusation, providing documentation that suggested possible impropriety. Within a week, my brother's world started collapsing. The financial aid investigation froze his student loans mid-semester. The credit agencies flagged his accounts for suspicious activity. The medical board opened an ethics inquiry that suspended his clinical rotations pending resolution. He called our parents in a panic, claiming someone was sabotaging him, insisting he was innocent of any wrongdoing. But the evidence was overwhelming, and all of it pointed back to him. Our parents, already financially strained and emotionally exhausted, faced an impossible choice. They could spend tens of thousands more trying to fix his problems, hire lawyers and accountants and investigators to sort through the mess. Or they could cut their losses and focus on their own survival. They chose themselves. My brother was kicked out of medical school 3 weeks later. The financial obligations I'd created in his name became his legal responsibility. The credit damage was severe enough to affect his ability to rent apartments, get jobs, even open bank accounts. Everything unraveled exactly as I'd planned. The phone call started on a Tuesday evening in June. My mother's voice was shaky, desperate in a way I'd never heard before. She begged me to call back, said they needed to talk, that there had been a terrible misunderstanding. I listened to the voicemail twice, then deleted it. My father's message came an hour later. More controlled, but equally urgent. He asked if I knew anything about my brother's situation, if I could help them understand what had happened. He mentioned that they'd been wrong before, that maybe they could work something out. I didn't return either call. The messages kept coming, multiple times a day at first, then gradually tapering off to once daily, then every few days. They ranged from pleading to angry to confused to desperate. They offered to help with my medical bills, promised to make things right, swore they'd never realized how much they'd hurt me. But it was too late for that. Update 1. 2 months after the call started, my brother showed up at my apartment. He looked terrible, thinner, older, defeated in a way I'd never seen. He stood in my doorway asking if we could talk, if I could help him understand what was happening to his life. I told him I was sorry things weren't working out, that sometimes life was unfair that way. He stared at me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. For a second, I thought he might have figured it out. But then he just nodded and walked away. I never saw him again. My parents came by the following week. Together this time, looking every bit as broken as their golden boy. They sat in my living room. The same living room where I'd recovered from surgery alone, and tried to explain themselves. They said they'd made a mistake. that they'd been scared and overwhelmed and hadn't thought clearly. They offered to pay off my medical loan, to help me however they could. They asked what they could do to fix our family. I listened to everything they had to say. When they finished, I told them I appreciated their visit, but that I was doing fine on my own. They pressed harder, insisting they wanted to make things right, that families should stick together through difficult times. The irony wasn't lost on me. I walked them to the door and wished them well. As they left, my mother turned back and asked if there was anything I needed, anything at all that might help rebuild our relationship. I told her I'd already gotten everything I needed from them. The clarity they'd provided that day in their kitchen had been invaluable. Update 2. 6 months later, I received a letter from a law firm. My brother was suing me for identity theft and fraud, claiming I'd systematically destroyed his life and career. He had no proof. Of course, I'd been too careful for that. But he was desperate and grasping at any possibility of salvation. The lawsuit was dismissed within weeks. The evidence was clear that he was responsible for all the financial activity in question. The judge seemed particularly unimpressed with his attempts to blame family members for his own poor decisions. My parents called after the dismissal, their voices hollow and defeated. They said they knew I hadn't done anything wrong, that they were sorry for everything that had happened. They asked if we could start over, maybe try family therapy or counseling. I told them I'd already moved on and hung up. The truth is, I had moved on. The medical loan was nearly paid off thanks to a promotion at work. My health was stable. I'd started dating someone who actually valued me for who I was rather than comparing me to their ideal version of what I should be. For the first time in my adult life, I felt genuinely content. Update 3. A year and a half after everything began, I learned that my parents had lost the house. The second mortgage payments, combined with the legal fees from my brother's lawsuit and their continued attempts to help him, had finally broken them financially. They moved into a small apartment across town. My brother was living with them, working part-time at a retail job, and still trying to clear his name. They'd all fallen so far from where they'd been when they decided I wasn't worth saving. I felt nothing when I heard the news. No satisfaction, no regret, no sympathy. Just nothing. The last voicemail I received was 3 months ago. My father's voice was barely a whisper. He said they'd been wrong about everything, that they finally understood what they'd lost. He said they loved me and hoped someday I might find it in my heart to forgive them. I saved the message but never replied. People ask me sometimes if I regret what I did, if I feel guilty about destroying my brother's future or watching my parents lose everything they'd worked for. The answer is complicated. I didn't set out to destroy anyone. I simply wanted them to experience the same clarity they'd given me, the understanding that actions have consequences, that choices matter, that love isn't really love if it comes with conditions and favoritism. They taught me that family loyalty was conditional, that I was expendable when it mattered most. I just helped them learn that lesson themselves. Some might call it revenge. I prefer to think of it as education. They wanted to save my brother's future at the expense of mine. In the end, I made sure we were both equally saved. The equality they denied me in love, I provided in consequence. And honestly, I sleep just fine at night. The clarity they gave me that February morning was indeed invaluable. It freed me from years of hoping for acceptance that was never coming, of trying to earn love that was never really available to me. I learned that sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you deserve. And sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is to stop trying to fix what was broken from the start. I built a new life. Better friends, better relationships, better understanding of my own worth. The medical bills that once seemed insurmountable became just another monthly payment. The spine surgery that they couldn't find worth funding saved my mobility and my future. Their phone stopped ringing months ago. I changed my number and moved to a better apartment in a nicer part of town. My address is unlisted, my social media private, my life deliberately separate from theirs. Sometimes I wonder what they tell people when asked about their youngest son. Do they admit what they did? Do they fabricate some story about my choices driving us apart? Do they even think about me anymore? It doesn't matter. Their opinions stopped matching the moment they made their choice clear. I learned something valuable about human nature through all of this. People will always tell you who they are if you listen carefully enough. My parents told me exactly who I was to them, exactly what I was worth in their eyes. I simply chose to believe them, and then I chose to show them exactly what that meant. The final tally is interesting when you think about it. They lost their retirement savings twice. once to bail out my brother, and again when their choices caught up with them. They lost their house, their financial security, their family structure. My brother lost his career, his future, his sense of self. I lost nothing I hadn't already been told wasn't worth keeping. But I gained something invaluable, the knowledge that I could survive on my own, that I was worth more than they'd ever recognized, that their definition of my value was irrelevant to my actual worth. The calls may have stopped, but the lesson remains. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is showing you exactly where you stand. It might hurt in the moment, but it frees you to build something better. And I did build something better. A life where I'm valued, respected, and loved unconditionally. A life where my worth isn't constantly measured against someone else's potential. A life where I finally matter. That's worth more than any family reunion could ever be.